Okay, welcome to Plot Diagram Vocabulary. This is the second lecture for sci-fi and fantasy fiction and the second outline. So if you haven't got your outline, the first thing to do is go find your outline in your folder or go print one off of the website. All right, today we're going to talk about plot diagram vocabulary. A plot diagram is just a visual representation of the plot or the events in a story. It's made up of 6 different stages. The first stage is called the exposition. Sometimes it's called the introduction. They're used interchangeably. The second stage is called the inciting incident or the initial incident. The third stage is called the rising action. The fourth stage is called the climax. The fifth stage is called the falling action. And the sixth stage is called the resolution. So these 6 stages make up the parts of the plot diagram. And if you didn't get a chance to get them written down, don't worry too much because you're going to see them again on the next page. This is what a plot diagram actually looks like. Some people call it a witch's hat, other people call it a roller coaster. It doesn't really matter what you call it as long as you know what it looks like and what all the parts are. So here's your first part, the exposition. If you look at the beginning of our line, which starts here, the exposition goes on for just a little bit of the story. And then things change. When the line starts going up, that's the point where we have the inciting incident or the problem beginning. Then if you follow the line up, it goes up, 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 up. All this big long line here is the rising action. The rising action is the longest part of the story, and it stops when you get to the climax, which is the point that solves the problem. Then you have some falling action, which is not nearly as long as the rising action, and resolution, which is the last thing that happens in the story. Okay, plot lines. A story can have multiple plot lines. For a short story, usually there's only one plot line. For longer stories, there's 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 or 6. For movies, there are usually several as well. So we're going to take a look at the movie, The Raiders of the Lost Ark. If you haven't seen it, it's a fun movie. You might want to give it a shot. But it has at least 3 storylines. The first storyline is Indy looking for the Lost Ark. The Lost Ark is the Lost Ark of the Covenant where Moses put the 10 Commandments when he came down off the mountain. It's a religious artifact, got a lot of significance and supposedly a lot of power. The second plot line is Indy fighting the Nazis. The Nazis are also looking for the Lost Ark. So this is a race to see who can find it first. The third plot line is, of course, a love story where Indy falls in love with Marion. So if the story has multiple plot lines, your problem is, which one do you choose? The answer is it doesn't matter. You can choose any of them, but you have to choose one and only one for which to complete the plot diagram. You can't mix and match them. They all have to follow the same plot line. So we'll do that in our example. All right, the parts of the plot diagram explained. The first part is the exposition. And that's where we learn who the characters are and where the story is set. So for our example, Raiders of the Lost Ark, we meet 2 sets of characters. We meet the protagonist, who is Indy, and the antagonist, who are the Nazis, in addition to a bunch of other minor characters. We meet the monkey, we meet Sallah, there's lots of people that we meet. We also find out that the setting is at the university in the United States during World War II, but we also know that the whole movie doesn't take place in the United States or at the university. It moves around because Indy travels to gather artifacts for the museum. So we established that in the first 5 minutes of the movie. The inciting incident, also called the initial incident, is the point when the problem begins. Up until this, we have no problem. There's the people just going along normal, and going along with their daily lives, and then something happens to cause a problem. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, what causes the problem is Indy is given permission by the government to try and beat the Nazis to the Lost Ark. That's the problem. Who's going to get the Ark? Until this point in the story, there's no problem, because the small problem in the beginning with the French archaeologist Belloc has already been resolved. Indy didn't win. He lost. Now, we know that because that part was there, something's going to come back with it, but it's already been ended. The rising action is the longest part of the plot, and I do mean long. In a book or a movie, it covers almost 3/4 of the story. It's defined as the events that complicate the problem before it is resolved. So anything that happens between the time the problem starts and the time the problem is solved could be included in rising action, and that's a lot of stuff. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, the following things happen during the rising action. First of all, Indy and Marion team up. He doesn't want to be her partner. She doesn't really want to be his partner, but they kind of have to work together. So that's the complication, is how are they going to work together? The next complication is actually Indy finds the Lost Ark, and that doesn't seem like a complication, but because it's not in the climax spot, we know that's not the end. And what happens is, of course, Belloc, the guy we met in the beginning, steals the Lost Ark. And in fact, Indy gets captured by the Nazis. So all of these things happen to make this a bigger mess. The climax is the point when the problem gets solved. So the climax actually happens before the end. The climax is kind of in the middle. In the plot line for Raiders of the Lost Ark, the problem is who will end up with the Ark. So the Nazis actually end up with it, so they win, right? Isn't that the climax? Except when they open it, they all die. So actually, Indy ends up with it by default, and that's how we get to the hero getting the prize. The problem is resolved when all the Nazis die, and the hero ends up with the Lost Ark, which is, in any good story, what should happen. The falling action is everything that happens after the climax and before the end of the story. So there could be a lot of things in this section too. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, these are the things that happen in the falling action. First of all, Indy returns the Ark to the United States. And then he talks to the government. And the government takes the Ark for safekeeping, and Indy is told that he cannot talk about the Ark and that the government will study it. All these things happen before we get to the resolution or the end of the story. The resolution is when we find out how the story actually ends. It's usually the very last thing that happens in the story. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, the resolution is when we see the Ark being sent to a storage facility with lots of other boxes and left, implying that the government doesn't intend to study it, or in fact do anything with it other than keep it hidden. The resolution is typically the last thing to happen in the story, so it's whatever the last action is, no matter what that is. If it's a cliffhanger or if it's the very end of the book, it's the very last action that you're looking for. Okay, so we've gone through one example, and this is just one of the 3 plot lines in this 2-hour movie. We could explore any of them, but the point when you are reading a story is to keep them straight so that you can understand the story. Because what you're going to have to do on your test or in your project is explain what happened in the story. So this is going to help you find the theme and the author's point of view. And the theme and the author's point of view are things we will discuss in the next lecture, which will be coming with the next outline next week. All right, thanks, and see you in class.